William K. Stewart and F. E. Patzak, The New Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, based on the characters created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Episode 2, The Water of Life. An audiobook narrated by David McCran. In the late summer of 1884, Holmes and I were travelling to Scotland on official business. Holmes had received a telegram requesting his help with a case, and to my surprise, accepted it immediately. We weren't given much information, but Holmes reassured me. "My dear Watson, our client appears to not spare any expenses nor efforts, and this case could be just the challenge I was looking for. Pack your bags for a climactically refreshing sojourn to the northeastern foothills of the Highlands." Our 2-day journey began at 10 o'clock sharp at King's Cross railway station in London. The Flying Scotsman, a long-distance train that rightly deserves its name, took us to the Scottish capital of Edinburgh in fewer than 8 hours. Once there, we had to make a stopover. Our client had booked us a comfortable accommodation at the Waverley Hotel, not far from the railway station of the same name. The hotel is on Princes Street, which more or less divides the Old Town to the south from the New Town to the north. We resumed our journey the next morning. The train to Aberdeen did not run quite as quick. It took around 3 hours to get there, during which Holmes showed no interest for the passing landscapes, buildings, or ruins. He pored over chemical studies, taking notes as if they were of critical importance. When I once dared to ask him what he was doing, he just stammered, "Discontinuous distillation," and bowed out from our universe again. From Aberdeen, where to no avail, I attempted to evoke enthusiasm in my friend for how the buildings made of granite glistened with a silvery sheen, or at the very least, for the beauty of the North Sea coast, shaped by the tides. We took a branch line to Dufftown, our final destination. On the last miles of a very slow and long ride, Holmes was finally ready to share some details of the case. Mr. George Cowie, the rather elderly owner of the Mortlach Whisky Distillery, was the man who had sent the telegram, urgently requesting our, or to be honest, Holmes's presence. He underscored his wish by including an offer for generous compensation. "Holmes, I cannot share your optimism that this case could turn out to be a profound one," I explained. "Mr. Cowie received a threatening letter demanding that he give up his business. To me, this sounds like provincial parochialism or hypercritical puritanism, expressed as a simple prank." Holmes nodded. "Fair enough, Watson. Upon first inexperienced glance, your opinion may contain a certain degree of speculative merit. But you best stop thinking in such frivolous terms at once." Without warning, Holmes actually knocked my baffled forehead with his right fist and continued. "Mr. Cowie takes the matter very seriously, as conveyed by his tone and financial offer. If it does, in fact, turn out to be a prank carried out by a local religious zealot or confused moralizer, then so be it. But I'm expecting more." "Yes, but what?" I asked. Holmes smiled. "Death and decay, my dear Watson. That is what the letter is promising. What a fantastic prospect for an investigative diversion." "Holmes," I added suspiciously, "don't tell me you've ingested that cocaine solution of yours again." He shook his finger and his head. "Not necessary. Spiritual substitution, Watson. There will undoubtedly be more than enough of that where we are going." Having misinterpreted him, I briefly thought of a whisky storehouse. But naturally, Holmes was talking about his thoughts. He was not terribly fond of Scotch. From time to time he enjoyed a glass of Spanish or French brandy. Other than that, indulging in high-proof spirits was not among his habits. Meanwhile, we were approaching our destination. Through the large train window we could see, it was really mostly I who saw, the impressive ruin of the 12th century Balvenie Castle, located at the edge of Dufftown, from which the region was once ruled. The town itself lies in a bowl-shaped valley through which the river Fiddich flows, as described by its old Gaelic name Mortlach, which now is only borne by the Distillery. Originally said to be a Pictish settlement, one of Scotland's first Christian parishes settled here in the early Middle Ages, even becoming an important episcopal see for a time. The town has only been called Dufftown for around 70 years. Merited veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, glorious victors of Trafalgar and Waterloo, settled here and changed its name after the 4th Earl of Fife, James Duff. Today, no more than 1,300 people live in Dufftown and its surroundings. Naturally, I should have known better than to supply Holmes with this historical and demographic information. "Fascinating," he remarked after my lecture. "Fascinating with which trivialities you weigh your brain down. Any discussion on the qualification and evaluation of important, less important, and entirely useless knowledge had to wait since our train was already pulling into the small Dufftown station. I rushed to the door with our suitcases, as our journey would soon take us further to Inverness, where Macbeth was said to have killed King Duncan, at least in Shakespeare's brutal imagination. While I was waiting at the exit with our luggage, Holmes rose leisurely after the train slowly came to a halt. We were stepping down onto the narrow platform when a perhaps 45-year-old man approached us. On the outside, he looked like a burly Highlander, dressed rather unfittingly in work clothes. When he spoke to us, we sensed the sound of his Scottish accent needed some getting used to. "Hello, gentlemen. Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson?" he asked straightforwardly, and stretched out his hand to me first. I hesitated briefly, then dropped the suitcases on both my sides and returned his gesture. "Good day," I said, and shook the man's hand. "I am Dr. Watson, and this is Mr. Sherlock Holmes, consulting detective from London." Holmes nodded, quietly suggesting that he would like to forego any greeting formalities that involve physical contact. A continental extravagance, as he puts it. "My name is William Grant," the man explained. "Mr. Cowie sent me to collect you from the railway station." He picked up both suitcases and turned around. "If you would follow me to the coach." The coach, which stood just a few yards away, was a single horse-drawn carriage that looked like it would be better suited for the agricultural trade. Holmes ignored my reproachful glance. With some strain, the repercussions of war injuries I suffered in Afghanistan still limiting my agility, I climbed onto the loading bed and leaned against our suitcases, while Holmes took a seat next to Mr. Grant on the rather improvised coach box. During the ride down the wide and quite charming main street, which was extremely bumpy on account of the old, weathered, and simply too large cobblestones, Mr. Grant began to talk more freely. "I wouldn't have expected Mr. Cowie to actually summon a private investigator from London. That must cost him loads of louis." "An appropriate amount, given my abilities," Holmes responded calmly. "But since we're already on the subject, Mr. Grant, how does Mr. Cowie compensate the work of his dedicated staff?" "Staff is an overstatement," Grant clarified. "We hardly need any permanent employees. To make whisky, you first need the right barley, which we source from our local farmers for a reasonable price. You naturally also need high-grade water, clean and clear. We are currently in the process of purchasing our own sources. Then you need a barn for the malting, vats for the mash, and lastly pot stills for the distillation. Once you have the infrastructure and the technical equipment, the undertaking is not too costly, nor does it require much personnel. Then, of course, you still need a storehouse in which the whisky can mature in oak casks for at least 3 years, which it does all on its own. In brief, what you need the most of is time, and a small, flexible staff. And that's also what you pay for when you buy a bottle of whisky. Not the work that went into it, but the time. Before I could introduce any doubt into Mr. Grant's pretty picture of bought time by mentioning the latest developments in economics pertaining to the labour theory of value, Holmes dug deeper. "But you, Mr. Grant, are indeed permanently employed by Mr. Cowie's company, isn't that so?" Grant laughed. "Aye, Mr. Holmes, that's a fair assessment. I've been working for Mr. Cowie for 20 years. I'm the distillery manager." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "What exactly does that entail?" "Everything," Grant answered proudly and wearily at once. "Without me, nothing gets done. I purchase the raw materials, schedule the workers and their tasks, oversee all the processes, maintenance, the machinery, make the sales and handle the accounting." "And what does Mr. Cowie do?" Holmes asked. Grant thought about it briefly before smiling impishly. "I guess he bears the responsibility and the burden of ownership." After a brief and bumpy ride, the horse-drawn carriage came to a halt in front of a medium-sized townhouse in plain sight of Dufftown's distinctive clock tower. This is where Mr. Cowie resided and welcomed his guests. Naturally, his distillery was located a little further out of town. Grant opened the front gate with a key that he had in his possession. He led us past a small foyer down a hallway and straight to a large salon, where he asked us to wait for Mr. Cowie to arrive. Grant bid us farewell, telling us he needed to check the storehouse, and left us to ourselves for a few minutes. Holmes inspected the salon, the furniture, and all of the decor. Nothing stood out as unusual to me. "I suspected that would be the case," he said after a few seconds. I looked at him, perplexed. "What did you suspect?" Holmes tilted his head a trifle and began to lecture. "Mr. Cowie is one of those lower middle-class upstarts who are slowly but surely taking the place of the landed gentry. He comes from simple means, had access to a rigorous education, presumably in some technical field, and was outfitted with capital from several years of work in public service, which gave him the foundation for starting his own business and amassing a reasonable level of prosperity. He has survived his beloved wife. His son has successfully completed an academic degree, but presently resides outside the country." I walked around the room trying to comprehend how Holmes arrived at his observations, but it naturally remained a futile exercise. With a shake of the head, I capitulated. "How in God's name could you ascertain all of that?" "Elementary, my dear Watson," Holmes replied. "Let's take a look at the furniture. Solid craftsmanship, not cheap, but entirely mismatching. They were purchased rather indiscriminately, without any sense of what goes well together, typical for the nouveau riche. As you can see, Mr. Cowie has little appreciation for art, literature, and the humanities. The book spines of the standard works on his shelves do not show any signs of wear. They serve as mere decoration. The lord of the house is much more interested in technology and architecture. Look at those sketches of railway bridges, rail cars, and train stations. The signatures and dates suggest that Mr. Cowie had created these himself a long time ago. On his desk there is a framed photograph of a young man. Based on his clothing, the young man, who must be a relative, looks like he has just completed his degree when the photo was taken. On the wall over there hangs the corresponding medical diploma from the University of Aberdeen. The lighter wall paint surrounding it suggests that it has only been hanging at that spot for a short time, and surely just temporarily. The mere existence of it there, in fact, suggests that its owner is presently not practicing medicine, and is perhaps away on a long journey. There is no photograph of Mrs. Cowie. The only picture of her hanging on the wall is a portrait of a young woman, painted as long as 20 years ago, adorned with a black ribbon that has faded into grey. Holmes read the life of a man whom he had never met like an open book, which to me was both a remarkable feat as well as a trifle terrifying. But before I could express my mixed feelings, the salon door opened and Mr. Cowie entered. He was an older gentleman with thinning grey hair and a large handlebar moustache that ended in 2 points. He was dressed in an old-fashioned robe, but did not present as frail in any way. He approached with quick steps, greeted us, and offered us seats on 2 large armchairs. "May I offer you gentlemen something to drink?" he inquired straight away. "Just a glass of water for me," Holmes replied. "But Dr. Watson is a professed enthusiast of Scottish whisky." "Well then," Cowie said as he poured 1 glass of water and 2 of Scotch, "Dr. Watson will certainly be fond of our 16-year-old sort." He handed us the glasses and sat down in the third of 4 armchairs. "Cheers!" he exclaimed and raised his glass. Holmes and I followed his lead. Though while Cowie and I drank, Holmes put down his glass on the side table without having taken a sip of water. I was immediately struck by the superior quality of the whisky I was served. I could get used to this. There was a short pause, in which Cowie slowly swayed his glass back and forth pensively before raising it once more. "Do you know what this is? I mean, what a perfectly distilled whisky that has had many years to mature really is." "Time?" I interjected, recalling Mr. Grant's analogy during the coach ride. Cowie shook his head. "Why, no. The time that has been trapped inside the bottle represents the past. I'm speaking of the future." He raised his glass again. "In my hand I am holding pure life, an elixir of life in the broadest sense." As a medical doctor, I took issue with this claim. "But Mr. Cowie, as a physician I must remind you that an excess of your elixir of life can elicit addiction, illness, and death." "Not to worry, Dr. Watson," Cowie countered. "I certainly don't produce or sell my whisky to promote drunkenness. No, we uphold a noble tradition, adhering to millennia-old knowledge that Celtic druids passed down orally from generation to generation. And they very well knew what they had. Do you know, Dr. Watson, what the original Celtic word for whisky signifies?" "I must admit," I answered, somewhat abashed, "my Gaelic is a trifle rusty." "The English word whisky," Cowie explained, "comes from the Scottish Gaelic uiscia beha, which simply means water of life." He took a sip and let his words sink in, then continued. "I am now over 70 years old, and my daily ration keeps me young, especially mentally. And I have a vision. My whisky will breathe new life into Dufftown and the entire region. We don't have much here, just the usual agricultural work, which hardly yields any profits, and, in its present form, seems anachronistic. Then we have mining, and the production of building lime, a filthy industry, necessary for modern construction, but harmful to humans and the environment. That being the case, the future of Dufftown lies in whisky production. My plan foresees our city to become the whisky capital of Scotland. Nonsense! Of Britain, or better yet, the entire world. Blossoming landscapes, jobs, prosperity. The finished plans to expand production are sitting in my drawer. My son Alexander, who happens to be a colleague of yours, Dr. Watson, is presently in Hong Kong, and we will begin with the implementation as soon as he returns. Cowie paused, finished his glass, and turned to Holmes, who seemed to have been listening impassively and quietly. Now tell me, Mr. Holmes, who could have anything against us bringing Dufftown into the future? Who could be threatening to sabotage and ruin my business and make an attempt upon my life? Holmes was suddenly wide awake. Would you please show me the letter you received? Naturally, Cowie replied. He took a twice-folded note out of his breast pocket and handed it to Holmes. He skimmed the text and read some passages out aloud. To the tyrant. Last warning. Close the distillery. Leave the city. Otherwise you will meet your death. Holmes raised his head and looked at Cowie with a serious expression. You absolutely did the right thing in calling me. This is undoubtedly a very serious matter, which one should approach with utmost care and precaution. Watson and I will begin our investigation immediately. Cowie nodded satisfied. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. The Mortlach Distillery has been in operation for 60 years, since 1823. I became involved in 1853 when I left my job as an engineer for the North British Railway Company. In 1867, shortly after the unfortunate death of my wife, I became sole proprietor. I don't want its history to come to an abrupt end, especially not with my violent death. If that were to happen, however, Mr. Holmes, I would kindly ask you to bring down my murderer. It would certainly be my honour and pleasure, Holmes replied. However, that won't be necessary. I intend to put a stop to the perpetrator's game before it comes to that. After Mr. Cowie showed us to our rooms, Holmes and I parted ways. Holmes wanted to look into Cowie's business records and tasked me with accompanying Mr. Grant on a tour of the distillery. My personal interest in whisky, I must admit, is limited to the end product, and I can only muster up so much enthusiasm for the process and technical minutiae of its production. I sensed that Mr. Grant was astutely aware of my feelings during the tour of the facilities. Do not despair, Dr. Watson, he said, winking. We have already seen the centerpiece of our production, the copper stills. If you wish, we can finish the tour with a look at the storehouse and the filing system. The subject matter will then become, how shall I say, more practical in nature. Mr. Grant presented as a pragmatic who worked hard and clearly knew everything there is to know about whisky production. As a matter of fact, he was also quite fond of indulging in the good stuff himself. At the end of the tour, he requested I accompany him to his office. It was sparsely decorated with a simple table, 2 chairs, and improvised shelves full of ring binders. He invited me to sit on one of the 2 chairs, took 3 unlabelled bottles and 2 glasses out of the cabinet next to the door, and set them down onto the table. Now, Dr. Watson, he began as he seated himself, let's get to the pleasant part of the tour. He opened the first bottle and filled both glasses. The drink had a yellowish colour. This is our basic product, our 3-year whisky. It's minimalistic, a bit rough, very straightforward, Scottish through and through. Not fit for an English dandy, but for real men, like those who fought alongside Robert the Bruce and William Wallace. He raised his glass. I picked up mine and we clinked. "Slange, Dr. Watson," Grant said, before emptying his glass in one sip and banging it down on the table. For the greater honour of England, I could not hold back. "Cheers! God save the Queen!" I cried, and also drank up in one go. Grant smiled. "And?" I had to cough. It was clear that the ingredients and production of the whisky was of a superior quality, but also that it lacked maturity. Its harshness aggravated my palate and throat, and its vapour rose into my inner nasal passages. Indeed, a drink such as this one would not be served in a London club, and rightly so, I may add. "Most invigorating," I assessed, after having collected myself. Grant grabbed the bottle. "Another one?" "Gladly," I replied without hesitation. As he filled our glasses for the second time, I attempted to steer the conversation to my own advantage. "Mr. Grant, you avoided answering me this at our first meeting. How would you judge the conditions and compensation of working with Mr. Cowie?" "If you promise," Grant began, "that our conversation will remain confidential, I'll be honest with you." I nodded yes, and he continued. "As I see it, Mr. Cowie is an exploiter and oppressor." I was taken aback by his characterization. "I just met Mr. Cowie today," I said, "and he gave me the impression that he regarded himself as a philanthropist. He has grand plans, wants to create jobs." Grant made a dismissive motion with his hand. "Profit is what he's after, the old leech." He drank down his glass again in one sip, and again, wanting to keep up, I followed his lead. "That's rather harsh," I said, gasping for air. "Would it be so bad if the distillery developed into a flourishing large business that could provide a living for many in Dufftown and its surroundings?" Grant shook his head. "The prices we pay our farmers for their barley is hardly enough for them to survive, and we're already taking a good 30% of their better harvest. The distillery workers only have short-term contracts and are regularly without work or income. That's Mr. Cowie's business model. But as his distillery manager, you support him. Why?" I asked. As he poured us a third glass, Grant explained. "That's true, Dr. Watson, I do. But I have my own plans. I'm saving every penny that I don't need to survive. And in 2-3 years, I'll open my very own distillery." This time, I was first to raise my glass. "I wish you much success for your endeavour." We clinked glasses and drank up. "But it will hardly please Mr. Cowie to lose his most valuable employee, especially if that employee is preparing to become his competitor." Grant nodded. "Of course it won't. He wants a monopoly. He wants to be in control of everything and everyone. Everyone should be dependent on him in every way. Did you know that Cowie has already served as mayor here?" Spontaneous laughter escaped my lips, and Grant followed suit. His manner promptly turned serious again. He closed the bottle of 3-year-old Scotch and set it aside. "Enough of that," he said. "I'd like us to sample the 8-year-old whisky." He picked up the second bottle, opened it, and filled our glasses. The drink was significantly darker with a slight red sheen, almost the colour of copper. "You could say this is our standard product," Grant explained. "After 8 years, the whisky has certainly had time to develop a richer colour." He swirled his glass. "And look how it curls up the edges of the glass, almost like a purring cat." I tried my hardest to discover the cat in my glass, but failed, and then caught myself saying, "Here, kitty kitty," which took me by surprise. Grant, whose lips were already pressed against his glass, had to laugh so hard he almost spilled his drink. I like you, Dr. Watson. We have a similar sense of humour. We clinked glasses and again drank up our whisky in one sip. The mild softness of the 8-year-old sort enveloped my mouth and throat in a soft cotton, while the tip of my tongue felt slightly numb. My gullet, however, felt as if it were being tickled by cat hairs. I cleared my throat and returned to discussing the case. Now, Mr. Grant, you would have to admit that your attitude towards Mr. Cowie makes you a potential suspect in the case of the threatening letter, wouldn't you? Grant poured us a 5th glass without batting an eye. Surely, Dr. Watson, it would certainly benefit me if my future competitor were to be harmed or even eliminated. That being the case, I am currently still dependent on Mr. Cowie. The salary I receive from him is the founding capital that I am in the process of accruing. Even if my income is limited, in some, and in the foreseeable future, it will meet my needs. And don't forget all the skills I'm learning as distillery manager. No, Dr. Watson, it wouldn't be very wise of me to bake my golden goose too soon. I have thus always conducted myself most correctly and loyally towards Mr. Cowie. I couldn't simply dismiss his argument. I looked at him with an analytical expression and nodded. Indeed, Mr. Grant, that seems to be the case, provided, Grant interrupted and raised his right pointer finger. Provided I'm telling the truth. I could also simply be engaging you in a game of calculated misdirection. We stared at each other, stern-faced, then both erupted in laughter and drank down our 5th glass. In retrospect, I cannot deny that the fraternizing, uplifting, and soon mentally incapacitating qualities of alcohol had already begun to take effect. All right, Mr. Grant. I made another criminological attempt. If you're not the perpetrator, perhaps you can help us find him. What can you tell me about Mr. Cowie's friends and foes in the area? Grant grabbed a 3rd bottle. This is our 16-year-old whisky. Mr. Cowie's best friend. His only friend, to be precise. What about his son? I inquired. Alexander, Grant said as he filled our glasses with the premium product of the Mortlach Distillery. As a fine young man. But he put half the world and 2 oceans between himself and his father. What do you think that implies? He slid my glass of whisky back to me across the small table. The brown liquid shimmered and sparkled, and the consistency now almost seemed viscous. Admittedly, I reached for the glass with some impatience. You won't find a better whisky anywhere else, Grant declared. Not even in Ireland, let alone in England. He raised his glass and made a toast. To Scotland! As if possessed, I jumped to my feet and shouted, Long live the Empire! And drank down my whisky. Grant looked at me puzzled, before breaking out in a grin. He too sprang to his feet and clicked his heels. Rule Britannia! He cried, finished his whisky, and saluted with the empty glass still in his hand. I immediately joined in, and we burst into the chorus twice before sinking back down into our chairs. I was afraid Her Majesty the Queen would not have been amused by our most questionable performance. Well now, Mr. Grant, I said, focusing on speaking cohesively. Let's talk about Mr. Cowie's foes. What can you tell me about them? Grant picked up the bottle of 16-year-old whisky and examined it. Quite a lot, Dr. Watson, he replied. But it will take some time. Time is no issue, I countered and slid my empty glass back across the table. To my eternal regret and disgraceful shame, this was the last I remembered clearly and indubitably. The rest of the evening with Mr. Grant and the 3 bottles of whisky became increasingly blurred in a fog of good old, or rather indecorous, drunkenness. Only incoherent scraps of conversation and insipid facial expressions haunt my memory. Under normal circumstances, this episode would have marked my greatest transgression and eternal disgrace in the many years of my partnership with Holmes. The next morning, I was awoken by someone knocking forcefully at the door to my room in Mr. Cowie's townhouse. I woke up in my bed, disorientated, still wearing my clothes from the night before. When I sat up, I felt a sharp pain in my head that was aggravated by the repeated pounding. "Come in," I groaned. "But in heaven's name, would you please stop knocking?" Holmes entered and approached my bed, where he clearly scrutinized me. "Excellent, Watson," he said. "You're already dressed. How are you feeling?" I sat at the edge of my bed. At least it seemed I had taken off my shoes last night, and stammered, "Water. I could use a sip of water." Holmes looked around, walked over to the credenza where he poured me a glass of water from a jug, and brought it to me. "Here you go," he said. "You're clearly a tad dehydrated, a logical consequence of excessive alcohol consumption." "Thank you, Holmes," I answered, as I grasped the glass and took a large mouthful. "As far as I know, I am a physician. I'm aware of the consequences of alcohol abuse. What I don't know is how I got here." Holmes gave me a confidential smile. "Oh, Mr. Grant was so kind as to bring you here. We then carried you up the stairs together and brought you to your room." I slowly became aware of the extent of my transgression. Seldom have I ever experienced a more embarrassing situation. "Listen, Holmes," I started with some trouble getting the words out. "I'd like to formally apologize for my behavior. It was inexcusable and highly unprofessional. I hope you don't think too poorly of me." "Remain calm, my good Watson," Holmes replied. "We'll consider your infantile escapade as a single mishap. Your talent for singing, on the other hand—" He said no more and shook his head in pity. I anticipated something bad. "Did I sing?" I asked, already suspecting the answer. Holmes smiled. "You could call it that. You and Mr. Grant arriving here intoning the Scottish anthem, the March to Bannockburn. Mr. Grant has apparently managed to turn you into a patriotic Scotsman in a trice." I drank down the glass of water to stall for time. "That was the whisky." I tried to defend myself. "Did I do or say anything else I should know about?" Holmes suddenly turned serious. "You don't know?" "What don't I know?" I asked anxiously. "What did I do? Tell me, Holmes." Holmes paced back and forth across my room without saying a word. He then stopped directly in front of me and looked at me with piercing eyes. "After we brought you upstairs and Mr. Grant left, you fell into bed. I was about to leave the room when you suddenly sat up and exclaimed, 'I solved the case! I know who it was!'" "You must be joking," I said. Holmes firmly shook his head. "No, I am not. You insisted that you had solved the case." "And," I asked impatiently, "who's the perpetrator?" "I don't have the slightest notion," Holmes replied. "You couldn't say. You fell back asleep at once." I was outraged that I had no memory of this discovery. "This can't be true, for heaven's sake! Holmes, why didn't you try to wake me again?" "I certainly did," Holmes replied. "But to no avail. You were sound asleep. Only once did you mumble, 'Water. It's about water.' Does that ring a bell?" I laboured over it, but I could not think of anything. Unfortunately not. Well now, that's most regrettable. We will thus have to solve the case a second time. Honestly, I stammered, massaging my pounding head, I'm afraid I'm not quite in the proper condition to do so. You don't want to keep tormenting me now, do you? Holmes smiled good-naturedly, which did not necessarily portend anything good. Nothing of the sort, dear friend, he claimed. But I suspect the answer lives somewhere in there. He knocked on my forehead with his fist. Good heavens! I cried, sensing a sharp pain that made me jump to my feet. Stop it! Oh, wonderful, my dear Watson, Holmes said unapologetically. Since you've gotten up, we'll help you get your memory back on track. What did you and Grant talk about yesterday? My head buzzed like a beehive, and it felt like one too. I grew a trifle dizzy and sat back down on the edge of my bed. Before Holmes could protest, I reassured him with a gesture of the hand. All right, Holmes, all right, I assured. I'll cooperate. Let me think. Mr. Grant. We spoke about his disdain of Mr. Cowie. He wants to open his own distillery. He has already designed an emblem for it, something to do with a stag. But Mr. Grant isn't the perpetrator. Or is he? Holmes interjected. No, I answered quickly. Then I inquired whether there are any conflicts in Dufftown in which Mr. Cowie is or was involved. Grant told me Cowie wants to control everything and everyone, establish a monopoly. And he already has, to a degree. He is the main purchaser of barley harvested by local farmers, and as such dictates the price. He is in negotiations to purchase the land surrounding the headwaters of the River Fiddick. This will give him access to sufficient high-grade, clear and clean water for his whisky production. Water? Holmes repeated. You said the answer lies in water. But that doesn't make any sense, I refuted. The farmers don't need any spring water. We're in the north of Scotland. More rain falls from the heavens here than is necessary for the fields to flourish. That's certainly true, Holmes replied. But who else could be involved in a dispute over the right to access and use water? The pain in my head flared up again. I was only barely able to string together a coherent thought. I'm sorry, Holmes, I whispered. I must lie down again. The water of life has completely calcified my brain. And in that moment, I solved the case once again. Holmes! I cried, briefly flinching from the sharp pain in the back of my head. Holmes! I repeated a trifle quieter to be safe. That's it. Lime production. It requires large amounts of water, and the process requires some of the water to become contaminated and returned back into the river. By purchasing the Fiddick inlets near Dufftown, Cowie will make this impossible. Large parts of the lime production would have to be shut down. The owner would be ruined. Holmes nodded acceptingly. Excellent, my dear Watson. That's the answer. I suddenly felt full of drive. On now, Holmes, I urged. We must go. We must inform Mr. Cowie. And the police. They have to arrest the lime producer immediately. Mr. whatever. I don't know his name. Mr. McGregor, Holmes explained. The owner of the local building lime company is Donald McGregor. I paused. How do you know that, Holmes? Be that as it may, he must be arrested. Holmes nodded. Quite right. That's why Mr. McGregor has been in the custody of the police since yesterday. And this morning, while you were still asleep, he was transferred to Inverness, where he is awaiting trial. But I don't understand, I stuttered. What's this about? Since yesterday? Already transferred? Holmes, what is going on here? Holmes lay his hand on my shoulder. "Calm down, dear Watson," he said to me as if he were speaking to an ill child. "What you need is rest. Get some good sleep. You've had a rough night. Our train to Aberdeen is departing in the early afternoon. I will wake you in time and explain everything." At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, on the spot, we were sitting on the regional line departing from Dufftown. The case was solved, the perpetrator in custody. Mr. Cowie, thrilled by the positive outcome to his predicament, kept his promise of a generous compensation. As the train left the station with several blows of the whistle, Holmes made quite a content impression on me. Only I was not so sure of what to make of the whole thing. Relieved from the worst of my headache and somewhat clear-minded, I tried to make sense of the events that occurred in the past 24 hours. I still did not understand what game Holmes had played with me and why. I stared at him before getting up the courage. "Tell me, Holmes, you solved the case before I did, didn't you?" "Indeed," Holmes replied, "but that's really nothing to be ashamed of. In return, you came up with the solution twice, even whilst mentally impaired. Uncommonly impaired, I meant." "Thank you," I growled. "And when? When did you know who was responsible for drafting the threatening letter?" "To be honest," Holmes explained soberly, "it wasn't that difficult. I found the perpetrator right after you had left for the distillery yesterday afternoon." This was what I had feared. All of my endeavours, not to mention the escalatory whisky tasting, were entirely superfluous. "And how, Holmes," I sighed, "did you find the perpetrator within just a few minutes?" "Well, Mr. McGregor made it quite easy for me. He apparently lacks any talent for crime, which is somewhat disappointing. I simply looked at Mr. Cowie's business correspondence and, as expected, soon discovered several letters written to him that contained handwriting, which, in its most distinctive parts, matched that of the threatening letter. There was thus no need for any further graphological analysis. The corresponding handwriting samples were both signed by Mr. McGregor, leading to the conclusion that the threatening letter also stemmed from his feather. When I confronted him in the late afternoon with this fact, he did not try to deny it, nor did he resist being arrested by the police. "That's simple," I exclaimed. "And when, my dear friend, were you planning on telling me all of this?" Holmes shrugged innocently. "I'm telling it to you now." I buried my face in my hands. My headache returned abruptly. "Watson, is everything all right?" Holmes asked. "I have something for you if you're feeling unwell. Mr. Grant's schedule wouldn't allow him to bid you farewell personally. He sends his regards and asked me to give you this small gift from him." Holmes pulled an unlabelled bottle of whisky out of his briefcase and held it under my nose. "Good heavens!" I moaned. "Put that stuff away." "How ungrateful!" Holmes said with an annoyed expression. "In the end, you will probably accuse me of having taken on the case for your sake." "For my sake?" I asked, dumbfounded. "What do you mean?" "Well," Holmes explained, "it was clear to me from the beginning, as soon as I read the telegram, that this case was nothing more but a petty matter, and that the long journey up almost the entire island would be little more than a waste of time." "But," I interjected. Holmes smiled smugly. "My dear Watson, lately you have seemed a trifle glum on Baker Street. I thought you needed a bit of a diversion, and that a little task would do you well. I couldn't have suspected that you would turn it into an infernal drinking session." I fell back into my seat feeling exhausted. It began to rain, and drops of water trickled down the window pane as we crossed the bridge over the River Fiddick. I still had a good 12 hours of travelling by rail to think about my life. "Would you do me a favour, Holmes?" I asked. "Certainly," he answered with a friendly sense of duty. "The spirits of life wish to be stirred again," I announced. "Would you please pass me that bottle of whisky?"